Look up at the tallest tree you have ever seen. Maybe it was a redwood in California, pushing 300 feet into the sky. Maybe it was a Douglas fir or an ancient oak wider than a car. You stood at the base and tilted your head back and felt small. You felt genuinely, measurably small. Now imagine that tree is a sapling. Imagine that the thing you were looking at, the thing that made you feel like an insect, was not even a mature specimen. Imagine that above the canopy you were staring into, there was another canopy, and above that another. Imagine that the real forest, the original forest, made the redwoods look like weeds. This is not a fantasy. This is geology. This is fossil evidence. This is the question that a growing number of researchers, historians, and independent scholars are asking. Well, not because they want to be controversial, but because the evidence keeps pointing in directions that the official story refuses to follow. Where did the giant trees go? Why do the oldest maps show mountain ranges that we now call rock formations? Why does the Tartarian architecture of the 19th century show buildings with ventilation systems built directly into the walls, with ceilings so high that a man on horseback could ride through the front doors? Why are the people in photographs from the 1800s consistently smaller than the door frames, the windows, the furniture they are standing next to? And why, most importantly, does the oxygen record in ancient ice cores show concentrations that would make modern humans feel like they were breathing pure electricity? We are going to answer all of that today, and by the time we are finished, you are going to look at a forest differently. You are going to look at a mountain differently. You are going to look at a photograph from the 1880s and notice something you never noticed before. The story starts with oxygen, not the concept of it. The specific, measurable, terrifying fact that the air we breathe today is not the air this planet was designed to produce. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica and Greenland contain trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere. These bubbles are time capsules. Scientists can extract them and measure the exact composition of air from thousands and tens of thousands of years ago. What they find, consistently, is that oxygen levels in the ancient past were significantly higher than the 21% we breathe today. Some measurements in amber and fossilized tree resin that sealed ancient air inside itself like a biological time capsule show oxygen concentrations of 30% and above. 30% oxygen. Let that land for a moment. You breathe 21% right now. At sea level, with a full night of sleep and no stress and good health, you breathe 21%. Athletes train at altitude to force their bodies to adapt to less. Hospitals pump additional oxygen into patients who cannot survive on ambient air. We treat 21% as the baseline, as the normal, as the God-given atmospheric composition of planet Earth. But the planet's own record says otherwise. At 30%, oxygen combustion happens faster. Fire spreads with a violence that modern fire models cannot replicate. Insects grow larger because they breathe through their bodies, through spiracles and tracheae, and the size they can reach is directly limited by how much oxygen can diffuse through tissue. At 30%, that limit expands dramatically. Dragonflies with wingspans of 2.5 feet, millipedes 8 feet long, scorpions the size of dogs. The fossil record is full of them, and paleontologists explain them as products of ancient high oxygen atmospheres without fully examining what produced that oxygen and what happened to it. The answer to what produced it is the one nobody in mainstream science wants to say out loud. Trees. Not the trees we have now, not the forest we are fighting to preserve in the Amazon, not the managed timber operations in Scandinavia, not the suburban tree canopy in your neighborhood, something else, something that makes our tallest trees look like ground cover. The Carboniferous period. Roughly 350 to 300 million years ago is named for the carbon it deposited. The coal we burn today, every seam and deposit and underground layer of fossil carbon on this planet, is the compressed, fossilized remains of that era's forests. Geologists know this. It is not disputed. What produced the coal was biological material on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Lycopsids, club mosses, fern relatives. In the Carboniferous period, these grew to heights of 100 to 160 feet. Sigillaria trees with trunks 3 to 6 feet in diameter, growing in dense stands. Lepidodendron trees reaching 150 feet, their bark covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars that still appear in coal mines today. These were not small plants that happened to get compacted over millions of years. These were forests of biological production so massive that when they died and fell, the fungi and bacteria that would normally decompose them did not yet exist. The lignin in their wood was a new biochemical compound. Nothing on Earth had evolved to break it down yet, so the trees fell. And instead of rotting back into the atmosphere, they accumulated, layer after layer after layer, compressed under geological weight, becoming coal. The oxygen they produced during their lives went into the atmosphere and stayed there. That is where the 30% came from. That is the record in the amber. That is the record in the ice. Now hold that thought. Hold the image of those forests, those enormous photosynthetically hyperactive forests producing oxygen at a rate we cannot match today. Now hold the image of the creatures that lived under that canopy, scaled appropriately to the air and the resources available to them, and then ask the question, what killed the giant trees? The mainstream answer is geological time, slow change, continental drift and climate shifts and evolutionary replacement. The Carboniferous forests gave way to other ecosystems over hundreds of millions of years. That is the story. But here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the Tartaria question enters the room. Because there is a separate body of evidence, much more recent, much harder to dismiss geologically, that suggests the giant trees did not disappear 300 million years ago. That suggests they were still here, that the silicon dioxide formations we call mesas, buttes and rock columns in the American Southwest, the formations in Cappadocia, the formations in the Sahara, the formations across Siberia are not made of rock at all. That they are the fossilized silicated remains of trees so large that when they fell and converted to stone, we looked at them and thought they were mountains. This is the theory of the petrified giant trees. And it is not fringe internet speculation. It begins with a straightforward geological observation. Silicon dioxide is the primary mineral compound in wood after it silicates. When wood petrifies, mineral-rich water permeates the cellular structure and replaces organic material with stone, crystal by crystal, preserving the shape. We have petrified logs, petrified stumps. We have the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where ancient logs 200 million years old lie scattered across the desert. Their original cellular structure visible under a microscope, their grain and rings still readable. Those logs are 150 to 200 feet long. They are Triassic trees. They are already beyond anything alive today. Now look at the mesas of the Colorado Plateau. Look at the flat tops. Look at the vertical sides. Look at the internal layering that, when examined closely, does not match the random stratification of sedimentary deposition, but instead shows the concentric ring structures of biological growth. Look at the photographs taken in the early exploration of the American West, the daguerreotypes and wet plates from the 1860s and 1870s, showing geological formations that the explorers themselves described with a vocabulary of awe that went beyond anything they used for ordinary rock. Look at the specific shape of a tree stump, the flat top, the vertical sides flaring slightly at the base, the internal structure radiating outward from a central core. Now look at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Devil's Tower is 867 feet tall. It is made of igneous rock, the official explanation, volcanic intrusion that cooled and fractured into columns. The columns are hexagonal. They are regular. They extend from the base to the flat top with the kind of geometric precision that geology produces in specific conditions, and that biology also produces in specific conditions. The debate about whether Devil's Tower is a geological formation or the remains of a biological one is not resolved by pointing at it and saying it looks like a tree stump. But the people who argue for the biological explanation are not wrong to notice what they notice. The geometry is real. The flat top is real. The radial column structure is real. And the questions it raises are legitimate scientific questions, not conspiracy theories. Because here is the thing about conspiracy theories. They require a conspirator, a deliberate plan, a group of people deciding together to deceive. What the Tartarian evidence suggests is not a conspiracy. It suggests an event, a catastrophe so total, so complete, that it did not require anyone to cover it up because the survivors did not know what had been lost. The knowledge was not hidden, it was simply gone. Let us talk about Tartaria. The name appears on European maps from the 13th century through the 18th century, covering a territory that stretches from Eastern Europe across Central Asia to the Pacific coast. Tartaria, Tartary, the great empire of the Tartars. On some maps it is divided into Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. On some maps it dwarfs every other nation on Earth. On some maps it is simply labelled Magna Tartaria, Great Tartary. And then, in the 19th century, it disappears. Not through conquest, not through documented military defeat, not through treaties or revolutions that leave paper trails. It simply stops appearing on maps. The territory gets absorbed into Russia, into China, into nations we recognize today, with no official explanation for what Tartaria was, who ran it, or why it was so thoroughly erased that most people today have never heard the name. The mainstream explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire, that it was a geographic designation, a European cartographic convention for the vast and poorly documented lands east of the Ural Mountains, that the Tatars were a collection of nomadic peoples, not a civilization, and the label was a colonial approximation of incomprehensible complexity. That when Russia expanded eastward and the territory became documented, the label became redundant and disappeared. This explanation has merit. It is not unreasonable, but it does not account for the buildings. All over the world, in cities that were supposedly founded in the 18th and 19th centuries, there are buildings that do not match their official construction histories, buildings with foundations that go far deeper than the surface structures require, buildings with basement levels that were classified as subterranean even though they were clearly designed as ground floor spaces, with windows at street level that are now below the street, with door heights calibrated for occupants significantly taller than modern or 19th century humans. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century are the most concentrated example. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the 1889 Paris Exposition, the 1900 Paris Exposition, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. These events produced enormous architectural complexes, entire cities of neoclassical buildings constructed in timelines that professional architects today say are impossible. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 covered 690 acres. It included 200 buildings, many of them enormous, constructed over 2 years. Official accounts describe armies of workers, day and night shifts, industrial production scaled to a degree never seen before. The buildings were called the White City. They were demolished after the fair, almost all of them. Structures that took 2 years to build were torn down within months. This is the pattern the Tartarian researchers point to repeatedly. Grand structures built at impossible speed and then destroyed. Not repurposed, not converted to other uses. Destroyed. Why would you demolish a 60,000 square foot neoclassical building that took 2 years to construct? The official answer is that they were temporary, built of plaster over steel frames not meant to last. The fair was an exhibition, not a city. When it ended, the exhibition ended, but photographs of the interiors show pipe organs installed in the walls, mosaic floors, vaulted ceilings with frescoes, heating systems integrated into the structure. These are not the features of temporary exhibition buildings. These are the features of permanent infrastructure built by a civilization that intended to stay. And then there is the mud flood. The mud flood theory is the cornerstone of the Tartarian reconstruction. It holds that at some point in the recent past, centuries ago or possibly more recently, a catastrophic event deposited a layer of mud across enormous swaths of the northern hemisphere. The evidence is in the buildings. Specifically, in the buildings where the ground floor is now the basement, where windows that were designed at ground level are now underground, where door handles sit at knee height because the door itself was installed when the ground was 2 or 3 feet lower. Walk through the older neighborhoods of any major European city, or the older parts of San Francisco, or the older districts of St. Louis, and you will find them. Buildings where the ground floor has been converted to a basement, buildings where small windows near what is now street level look in at ceiling height, buildings where the stairs down to the current basement door are clearly original architecture, not a later excavation. The standard explanation is subsidence, gradual settling of buildings into soft ground, or deliberate raising of street levels for drainage. Both of these happen. Both are real. But subsidence does not raise the street, it lowers the building, and deliberate street raising leaves a record. Chicago famously raised its street level in the 1850s and 1860s, and there are detailed accounts and photographs of the process. Other cities have no such records. The ground level simply appears to have changed without documentation. The mud flood theory holds that a cataclysm, possibly a comet impact, possibly a solar event, possibly a geomagnetic reversal that caused massive flooding, deposited material across the landscape. The survivors, emerging from whatever sheltered them, found a world partially buried. They dug out what they could. What they could not dig out, they adapted. The basement windows became ventilation. The subterranean ground floors became storage. The street level was reset at whatever height the mud had settled to, and that became the new normal. This is not impossible. It is not even improbable. Flood layers appear in the geological record with regularity. The biblical flood narrative appears in cultures with no contact with each other, suggesting a real event significant enough to be encoded in myth. The Younger Dryas impact event 12,900 years ago left a layer of shocked minerals and iridium across North America and Europe, consistent with a large extraterrestrial impact or airburst. What would an event like that do to the atmosphere? Here is where the oxygen returns. A catastrophic impact or airburst event would produce enormous quantities of particulate matter. Soot, ash, mineral dust, aerosols. These would block sunlight. Sunlight blocked means photosynthesis reduced. Photosynthesis reduced means oxygen production reduced. The surviving forest, already stressed by whatever physical damage the initial event caused, would be producing less oxygen into a more polluted atmosphere. And if the theory of the giant trees is correct, if the original tree cover of this planet was not the forest we have now, but something vastly larger and more productive, then the destruction of that tree cover would have been catastrophic for atmospheric oxygen in a way that the loss of a normal forest simply would not be. Losing the Amazon reduces oxygen. Losing a forest of trees 1,000 feet tall with canopies covering continents changes the atmosphere permanently. The organisms that survived would need to adapt. Smaller body size means less oxygen demand. Over generations, species would get smaller, not through Darwinian evolution across millions of years, but through the kind of rapid phenotypic compression that starvation and atmospheric stress can produce within decades. Look at the fossil record for the transition period. Look at the megafauna extinctions. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, short-faced bears, dire wolves, giant beavers the size of bears, glyptodonts, terror birds. The vast majority of these go extinct in a geological eye blink clustered around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, corresponding roughly to the end of the last ice age and the Younger Dryas event. The standard explanation is climate change and human hunting pressure. Humans spreading across new continents hunted naive megafauna to extinction. Warming climates destroyed habitat. These factors combined to produce the mass extinction. This explanation has been challenged repeatedly. Many of these species had survived previous interglacial warming periods of comparable magnitude. The hunting hypothesis requires population densities and technological capabilities that do not match the archaeological record for early post-glacial humans. The alternative hypothesis that an atmospheric event produced rapid oxygen reduction overwhelming species adapted to high oxygen environments fits the timeline, the geography, and the pattern of which species survived. Smaller animals with lower metabolic demand survived better. Humans, highly adaptable generalists, survived. And so here we are, smaller than we were, breathing less oxygen than the planet was built to provide, living in cities built on top of older cities, with buildings whose windows sit below the street. The question of Tartaria is not really about Tartaria. It is not really about an empire or a map label or a geopolitical history that has been erased. The question of Tartaria is about continuity, about whether the civilization we inherited is really the civilization that was here, or whether we are the inheritors of a recovery, a reconstruction, an attempt to rebuild something after a catastrophe so complete that the people doing the rebuilding did not fully know what they were rebuilding from. The architecture suggests the latter. The buildings that appeared in the early 19th century, the grand neoclassical structures in St. Petersburg, in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Melbourne, in Buenos Aires, all sharing design languages that would require centuries of shared architectural tradition to produce spontaneously in multiple locations simultaneously, suggests that someone was working from memory, from a template, from a civilization that had existed before the one they were living in. The technology embedded in those buildings confirms it. the heating systems, the ventilation, the acoustic design of the great halls, the water management. These are not the technologies of a civilization in its early industrial period discovering these solutions for the first time. These are the technologies of a civilization deploying solutions it already understood, installing them into new structures as a matter of standard practice. Who taught the builders of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair how to install a pipe organ into a temporary exhibition building? Who taught them to design the acoustic properties of a hall they planned to demolish in 2 years? Knowledge without origin, practice without explicit history, the signature of a civilization reconstructing itself from fragments of a memory it cannot fully access. The trees are the key, because if the giant trees existed and the geological and fossil evidence gives us strong reason to believe something much larger than what we have now once covered this planet, and if those trees were cut down or destroyed by an event within the span of recoverable history rather than geological deep time, then the oxygen reduction they caused would have produced exactly the biological compression we see in the fossil and biological record. Smaller humans, shorter lifespans, reduced cognitive and physical capacity compared to what the fossil record suggests our ancestors possessed. The bones found in the older layers, the skulls with cranial volumes larger than modern averages, the femurs suggesting statures we associate with mythology, giants, the heroes of the ancient world. These are not myths about supernatural beings. They are memories of normal humans living in a normal atmosphere with 30% oxygen, fed by megafauna that no longer exist, in an energy environment the pre-catastrophe Earth provided and that Tartarian architecture was apparently designed to harness. The cover story is the one we call history. Consider what we actually know about the pre-1800 world versus what we are told. The primary sources for ancient history are almost entirely textual, produced by a tiny literate class, translated and curated by subsequent generations with their own agendas. The physical evidence is profoundly incomplete, governed by what has been excavated, what has been classified, and by academic orthodoxies that actively resist heterodox interpretation even when the physical evidence demands it. The standard history of 1000 CE to 1800 CE gives us a world of subsistence agriculture, feudal lords, and grinding poverty for the vast majority of human beings. A world in which architectural achievements of the scale we see in the surviving buildings are simply assumed without being explained, because explaining them would require invoking labour forces and engineering knowledge that the historical model of that period cannot accommodate. How did medieval Europe build the cathedrals? The engineering knowledge embedded in those structures, the acoustic design, the load distribution, the window-to-wall ratios optimized for lighting and structural integrity simultaneously did not come from nowhere. It came from a tradition, from a lineage of knowledge the builders were applying, not discovering. The same is true for the Islamic, Persian, Mughal and Chinese architecture of the same period. All of these traditions, separated by vast distances in an era of supposedly very limited communication, demonstrate shared structural principles suggesting not parallel independent development, but descent from a common source that was Tartaria or predates Tartaria, or is simply the civilization that existed before the catastrophe, the mud flood researchers say, buried the evidence. We are not the first civilization on this planet. We are probably not the second. We are the current attempt, built on foundations we do not understand, breathing air that has been degraded from what it once was, smaller and shorter lived than the beings who came before us, and living in cities that are palimpsests, and layers of occupation written over each other so many times that recovering what was originally written requires looking at what was preserved and asking why. Of all the things that could have survived, exactly these things did. The giant trees were the foundation. They produced the atmosphere. The atmosphere produced the biology produced the civilization. When the trees were cut down or burned or silicated into the formations we now mistake for mountains, the cascade began. The oxygen dropped, the creatures got smaller, the lifespans shortened. The technology to replace what the living forest had provided had to be invented or remembered or cobbled together from whatever fragments of the original knowledge survived. What we call the Industrial Revolution is, on this reading, not a revolution at all. It is a partial recovery. Humans rediscovering coal, the compressed remains of the original forest, and burning it to produce the energy the forest once provided for free. releasing back into the atmosphere the carbon the original trees had fixed, hoping new plant growth would eventually begin the long recovery of atmospheric oxygen. We are not at the beginning of a story. We are somewhere in the middle of a very long one, and the chapters that explain how we got here have been lost or buried or transformed into myth and dismissed. The rocks we drive past on the highway, the flat-top mesas on the horizon, the stone columns in the national parks, the silicified formations rising from desert floors. What if they are not rocks? What if they are what is left of the world before the world we know? What if the stumps are still there? I turned to stone, waiting for someone to look at them and say, something grew here. Something enormous grew here. And when it was gone, everything changed. The oxygen dropped. Everything alive got smaller. And the civilization that remembered what it was like before is the one we call Tartaria, the one that does not appear on any map after 1800, the one whose buildings we are still living in, whose foundations go deeper than our streets, whose towers we removed and forgot we removed, whose archive burned in fires that swept through cities with suspicious speed, and whose name, when you say it to most people today, produces a blank look that is itself a kind of data. That blank look is the evidence. You do not forget the name of the largest empire on Earth by accident.